Vernon Handley, when you were a young conductor and a student, was anyone talking about or listening to Bax's symphonies? How did you first come across his music?
Well, in my hometown of Enfield, North London, I had a very enterprising public library, and I used to go and ask them for scores. Now, I came across Bax because I was reading a wonderful book by Norman Demuth, if that's the way one pronounces his name, called Musical Trends in the 20th Century. And there was a great deal on British music, which I didn't know. I was brought up with, and brought myself up with, the classics. So at that time I read all my Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart and Haydn and so on, and was deep into the Wagner scores. And I was so surprised to find how warm he was about some British composers that I thought, well, I ought to read them. So I got the local library to get me some scores. And one of the scores that they got was a very charming study score, not miniature and not full, of The Garden of Fand by Bax. And I sat in my armchair at home and read it. And I was completely enslaved straight away. I couldn't understand how this music wasn't played. But no, very few people were talking about it. You occasionally got a tone poem on radio, but of course no symphonies. There was a symphony recorded, I think, at around that time. You see, I was born in 1930, so when would the Barbarolli Third Symphony recording have been made? That must have been around 1950, would it be? And that was, of course, a revelation, because it was such a beautiful performance. In some ways, for me, too beautiful at the end, because I see that Epilogue a slightly different set of values to Barbarolli. But nevertheless, Barbarolli's is a superb performance and gave me a lot at that time.
So you were already started on this journey with Bax. You were determined to find out more about him. But how did you find you were able to do this? Because you've got to not just... People knew some of the tone poems, obviously,
yeah.
and they'd come out Tintagel occasionally and things like this, but the symphonies, that's a whole different kettle of fish. How could you actually get this symphonic cycle, not just under your belt, but in front of the public?
Well, you couldn't. I'm now talking of my late teen years, you see, just before I went into the forces, because we were all press-ganged into national service in those days, and before I went up to Balliol at Oxford. And I only really started my conducting when in the forces, and that was usually with the brass band at the particular place where I was stationed. And when I went to Oxford, I was still very keen to conduct classics. But I did get the chance when I got the conductorship of the University Orchestra, University Students' Orchestra. I got the chance to do a few works, not Bax, because it was mostly too large in forces demanded, the exotic instruments and so on. But I managed to get some Moran played and some Malcolm Arnold, of course. And one's got to remember that I hadn't really started on the symphonic cycle because I hadn't really started to break out from the classical symphonic form. I couldn't understand, mind you, when I first read Bax 3, I couldn't understand why he was dubbed as a person who was meandering and vague and not really formally very controlled, because I could see and hear the relationships right the way through that particular symphony, which is really extraordinarily unified. So I couldn't understand that. But then I was an iconoclastic young man anyhow, so I was delighted to, sort of wrangle with people about it. When I heard people in those days, there wasn't much Mahler played, for instance, but when I had at university people, saying that Mahler was one of the greatest symphonic writers, and I said, well, I find his symphonies extended suites, but I find Bax a symphonic writer. Bax? No, of course not. No, meandering, vague, luscious, overscored, and so on, chromatic. But it was rather fun to join in those fights, as one usually does at university, and I stuck to my guns when I got a chance to read the Second Symphony, as well as No. 3, and realised that in the Second Symphony you have the entire thematic material laid out in the first 4 pages of the score. Most extraordinary ability the man has to use a metamorphosis technique, which to me is one of the most wonderful things about his music. You see, I find him the one thing that he doesn't have credit for. I find him formally and structurally very strong indeed.
But by the time you're talking about, people knew who the British symphonists were. They knew who to take seriously. They knew it was Elgar, they knew it was Vaughan Williams, and for his sole contribution, Walton. And if, by extension, if Bax's 7 symphonies hadn't come through at the same time, then they must have been second-rate. People were pretty sure.
That's right. This terrible thing of fashion in assessing composers, especially in Great Britain, is something that worries me dreadfully. For instance, I came across at that time the Moir and G minor symphony, which I think is a masterpiece in every way. That was not really recognised. I mean, there was a recording of that, I believe, in 1950 or thereabouts, and a very beautiful one as well. But this has been the problem. Bax was a declared brazen romantic, as you know, it's an often quoted phrase of his. And there seemed to be the suggestion that Vaughan Williams was not a brazen romantic. Elgar was all right, he was an older generation, so it didn't matter. Stanford and Parry, of course, were forgotten as great composers because they had nothing to say that wasn't in a European tongue. Now, if one examines what happened in Britain up to the First World War, you would find such people as Stanford and Parry as being important, and certainly a man with whom I've got a great deal in common, Bantock. After the First World War, it becomes the chance of the nationalist composers, the folk song composers and so on, Vaughan Williams, Holst, and then, of course, the young lion, Benjamin Britten, who does not write very much in extended form. So it was also implied that the symphony was on its way out. Of course, old Vaughan Williams would stick to it because he knew it was a great form. But generally speaking, I at that time had, as I've previously said, not really started to worry about the effect of symphony on me. I rather like the tone poems, you know, and it wouldn't necessarily be the symphonies even of Vaughan Williams that I would gravitate to. So it was a mess from the point of view of criticism. You had critics who liked the nationalist school of British composers and who liked Bax because of his his tremendous musical abilities. I mean, he just was a giant from the point of view of his comprehensive technique. But then there were others, as you know, who didn't want anything to do with that series of composers. They wanted to get back to Webern and so on, and Berg and Schoenberg, and have some real advance.
Something we should perhaps make more of are the parallels, certainly, with Vaughan Williams. Both men, Bax and Vaughan Williams, writing symphonies at the same time. There's plenty of mutual respect between them as well. Yeah. How similar are they in your mind, having done both cycles, obviously?
This is fascinating because they were great friends. They had great admiration for one another. Their procedure in symphonic writing is entirely different. Vaughan Williams's really great contribution, I think, to symphonic writing is his placing of things. He's not a great developer of tunes and ideas. Bax, on the other hand, is a person who knew that he metamorphosed his material. He laid out his material and then made his symphony out of it. It is called, I believe, a composing. But not many people gave him the credit for it. In fact, as I've already said, they said this is what he couldn't do. So their procedure, their ideas and their approach were entirely different. And yet they do occasionally, just occasionally, they cross spiritual paths with one another. I mean, Bax's moods are entirely different from Vaughan Williams's. And Vaughan Williams, although a confessed agnostic, is in fact a very, very religious composer, or at least it seems to me. Whereas Bax is a very wild and, in a strange way, pagan composer, and yet possessed of this extraordinary technique.
Let's talk for a moment about the people you see as being Bax's formative musical influences, the composers, first of all, who really helped shape the composer he became.
That's very difficult because there's a great disagreement about his admiration for structure and form. Most of us, I still subscribe to this, believe that although he found his own way into symphonic writing, Sibelius did have a tremendous influence on him. Whether it doesn't occur really early on in the symphonic cycle, but he was undoubtedly influenced by that. He was influenced too by people like Glazunov, a very much more straightforward way of proceeding with structure and form. And I think that Debussy and Ravel had an effect on him, but that, of course, is another one of the problems that comes up with Bax. The early critics of his work were that you couldn't see the wood for the trees. That is to say, he possessed a brilliant impressionistic technique, yet impressionism as such, as found in Debussy and Ravel, does not demand structural cohesion if they can get away with doing it in a brilliant way, which they do. There's no doubt about it. He always said, when people said that there was too much orchestration, too much chromatic harmony, too much going on, he always said, but of course the form of my works is perfectly classical and straightforward.
Well, let's talk about the first of the symphonies, Todd. This is Bax in his late 30s, so it's not an early work, really, 1920 and 21. This seems to have been almost an accident. He wasn't intending to write a symphony at all, was he?
Yes, it comes out of, well, it's said that it comes out of some of his friends, including Harriet Cohn, saying when he'd written, which sonata is it? It's the third, I think. The third, isn't it? Saying, what you've done is written a symphony. And he felt that the second movement of that sonata was not symphonic enough. Or perhaps it didn't contain the contrast that he liked to have, dramatic contrast, in all his works. But it's the first movement, I think, and of course the first movement does use material which comes back in the last movement triumphantly. I have no doubt in my mind at all that the heart of this symphony is the second movement. There are sounds in it which he doesn't attempt again, the most extraordinary elegy, and yet a sort of questioning elegy. It's not just nostalgic, and it's very, very dark, but his scoring in that movement is the thing that, for me, makes the symphony. Some people have found the return of the very first bar, because he states something in the first bar of the first movement which turns out to be almost a triumphal march in the last movement, have found that hollow. I don't think it is. I think this is a symphony that he's cast, obviously, not in his most original state. After all, it's virtually his first symphony. But there is another work which informs my study of No.1, and that is Spring Fire, which is, didn't get a performance in his lifetime. But it is, in effect, it is a single movement symphony written in 1913. And the same sort of procedure is informing the movements of the first symphony. That is to say, material laid out quite clearly, developed, contrasted with new material in the second movement, and then returning at the end in a triumphal form. It's not an easy triumph in Spring Fire, and it's probably the march-like nature of it in the last movement of the first is something that people object to. But why not? People have marches in their symphonies.
But then when you have that triumphal march, and it is literally that, that's the instruction given at the head of the third movement. And then in the slow movement, Bax asks for the side drum to be played with the loosened snares, as at a military funeral. And you think about the timing, and critics wanted this to be programmatic, didn't they? There's so many significant events to choose from. The Great War, the Irish uprising in which friends of Bax had been killed, there's the breakup of his marriage, the relationship with the young pianist Harriet Cohn, the death of Bax's father. Did Bax actually acknowledge any direct inspiration in the piece? No, not that I know of. In fact, he was rather keen on denying these things. I mean, like the program note, or the thing in the note in the score of The Garden of Fand, where he lays out in quite clear detail the legend, and then he says the incidents of the above left legend have nothing to do with this piece of music. I always love the man when he does that, because he says it's I wish to suggest this and that. You might think of that, and he says a number of things that you might think of, having already given you a perfectly clear picture. A great wave comes in the description of Fand. Yes, a great wave comes along, bearing the little boat to Fand's Island. We'll even hear it quite clearly in 4/4. Almost the sails collapsing. But of course, it has nothing to do with the piece of music. And he's right, in a way, because Fand has perfect form. ABCBA, isn't it? I think.
A, yes, D, the C. Then comes the tremendous dance on Fan's Island. Then comes Fan's Song of Immortal Love. Then the dance resumes. So we're on our way back. It's a perfect arch. We're on our way back. And at the end, the sea music from the beginning. Now, of course, the poor old Cuchulain's boat is going to be thrown to pieces during the return of the sea music, which is so violent when it was peaceful at the beginning. But eventually Fan's Island fades out of sight. It's all there, absolutely. It's programmatic, but in those days, program music was a bone of contention. So Bax says, of course, the music has nothing to do with it.
So what do you think? Obviously, he protests too much, but is this mischievous because he just wants to alert you to the fact that there is some kind of program in the First Symphony, and yet at the same time, he doesn't want it to be explicit because he does want it to be considered as pure music, as a symphony,
right.
And for you not to get hung up on the idea that it might be, in some way be addressing issues arising from the Irish Uprising or the Great War.
I think that when we get to the symphonies, he's much more concerned with having called the piece a symphony. So now I don't think he minds much. I think he's being mischievous, as you suggest, with things like Tintagel and the Garden of Fan. He is being mischievous because he was a super-educated man, after all. But when you get to the symphonies, he has this is the most important thing to me. The man has named a piece symphony, by which he is inviting the whole of the world to judge him on form. If he writes a symphony or a string quartet, he is vying with Haydn and Mozart and anybody who ever used those forms. And he's saying, come on, you trust me on this. I think that there must be an underlying emotional program in the first because it is such a dramatic symphony. And I think one's done a lot of reading around this, and one's done a lot of travelling as well and playing Bax everywhere. I think that there's probably more of the Easter Uprising than there is of the First World War. In that he did lose friends in the First World War, but by then he was thoroughly in the grip of Ireland. And of course he had wonderful friends over there.
Now, it was 2 years before Bax began working on his second symphony, and there's no question this time that it is a deeply personal and pretty anguished score. Yep. Not one he found easy to write either. What was the source of Bax's emotional upheaval at the time? This is 1924 to 26.
I don't know, and I don't care. What I do care about is something I mentioned before, that all the thematic material of that symphony is laid out in the first 4 or 5 pages of the score. So what I'm concerned about when I read that score is composition and how successful it is, or how successful one hopes one can make it if it hasn't been so far recognised as such. It is a very powerful symphony, once again, very dark.
Oh, and what an orchestra as well. It sounds so different. Give us some idea of just the forces that are being used.
Well, they are huge forces, of course, with the organ used just for pedals. So the tremendous depth of sound is one of the things that's important to it. Now here, there's something very important here. Bax doesn't get credit for being dramatic in allowing his symphonies to have contrast in them. That's to say, he doesn't get credit for fast music. He does write some fast music. The second movement, I mean, the first movement of the second is so dramatic. I mean, those organ pedals and so on, and the sound on the double basses, it creates a sound world that I don't think we hear again in British music until something like Vaughan Williams 6, which is a lot later. He knows that he created something in the first movement which was dark and very dramatic, and so he has something almost idyllic in the second movement, though still with material that he uses on those first few pages, and creates an entirely contrasting emotion. I mean, a very beautiful tune as well. He can write a tune whenever he pleases. I know that many composers have said to me when I've been talking to them about composition techniques and so on and procedures, they've said, but of course the difficult thing is writing a good tune. And Bax seems to be able to write one whenever he pleases. Second movement of the Second Symphony has the most beautiful wayward tune. And when he comes back to the last movement, he knows that he's now got to have a finale. It's interesting actually here because he has an epilogue type. which comes, of course, from the very first thing you hear on the cor anglais in the first movement. And the way he allows that symphony to peter out also is important to me, because it suggests to me that his symphonic cycle was going to be something like one huge utterance. And he knows he's leaving the second symphony for something to be said in his next symphony.
Well, the ending, it's unresolved despair, isn't
Absolutely.
it, really? And
Well,
you know there
is it
must be...
despair?
Well, maybe, but...
This is
It's unresolved,
problematic. It's certainly unresolved. You're quite right. There is a vast climax just before he does wind it down, which I think is when you say despair, I'm concerned that Bax creates moods which are very subtle. They're not something that you can... Perhaps this is one of the things that's told against the poor man. They're perhaps moods sometimes which the generality of people have never experienced. Well, what a wonderful thing that they can now come new to such moods through music. It's amazing to me that other composers are given credit for having told us something, and Bax is shouting or whispering something to us and people can't even hear. And I feel that the second symphony, unresolved, is correct. I'm not sure that it's despair. If it is, then the sort of resolution provided in the third symphony would be rather hollow. But I don't think it is. I think the epilogue of the third symphony, you see, he's won through to a world of beauty which he hadn't won through to before. That epilogue in the third symphony is really rather simple.
Todd, do you see those first three symphonies almost as a separate emotional trilogy from the other symphonies in the cycle?
Yeah,
they do sort of have a shape, don't they, across the
I
two?
think so. And I know that was the old-fashioned first critical reception of them, because when the fourth comes along, which is a blustery, happy symphony, and why shouldn't a composer writing 7 symphonies have a blustery, happy symphony in the middle? Beethoven does it rather well, and everybody praises him for it. Bax does it, and everybody says it's weak. So I'd still agree with you about that. I think that he reached, in the epilogue of the third, something he'd been searching for. Once again, the mood is important. Secondary importance, but rather important from the way we're talking, is the way he achieves it symphonically by use of certain ideas that were obvious on the first page of the symphony, and incidentally ends with a reharmonization of the very first notes we hear on the bassoon. People call that cyclic. It's not actually cyclic. He's just telling you that the notes he gave you at the beginning of his third symphony on the bassoon, and developed beautifully in the first movement, rather in classical form, have come back having experienced something during their course through the movements. And he's saying, and here it is now, we've arrived here. The three notes on the bassoon have arrived and sunk back after the experience of a lifetime in the symphony. So I agree with you about the first three symphonies, although nowadays people tend to say that Winter Legends ought to have been called number 4, which would have given him 8 symphonies, wouldn't it? Because Winter Legends is written roughly at the same time as number 4 and is generally thought of as a superior work, mainly because number 4 is a happy, blustery symphony.
But Lewis Foreman, Bax's biographer, reckons that Bax, the mature symphonist, didn't fully emerge until he'd written this third symphony at the end of the 1920s. Do you think that's fair, that this does mark a new direction, a new style in his orchestral music?
It certainly marks a new style, but I'll have a row with Lewis, because we're very great friends and I admire that wonderful volume of his, which I read regularly. It'll be easy to have a row with him because he loves the second. And I think that the style of the second is mature. The maturity of the third is in winning through at the end of it to this different view of beauty. It's a view of beauty, a hierarchical view of beauty. I think that's the right word, because there are different grades, which I believe is the meaning of that word. There are different grades of beauty and vision in Bax's work, in his symphonic cycle, especially arriving at an extraordinary vision at the end of the 6th, and a very, very personal goodbye vision at the end of the 7th. So, no, I think the second is a mature symphonic style. I think the third wins through to new moods.
Something else about the third. A couple of points. We know at this stage that Bax had definitely been studying Sibelius's scores, and he does acknowledge retrospectively, when questioned about it, that the Third Symphony does have in places some of the moods of those Nordic legends.
Oh yes, yeah. Although yes, I still find in the second movement of the third a good deal of Irish influence. I mean, I look in that movement once again in its wonderful beauty and at times quite a sunny beauty, not northern and dark. But I think that it looks back even to such early things as Into the Twilight, the first tone poem. But I think what Bax got from Sibelius at that time was this business of brooding power when he wanted it. When he's in light mood, he doesn't draw on Sibelius. He's very, very much more straightforward. Take the scherzo of the Third Symphony. I mean, when we were playing it up in Manchester recently, when you get to what might be called loosely the second subject in the scherzo, several people in the orchestra called out, "Hey, that's Malcolm Arnold." Well, of course, it's rather soon. I suppose Malcolm Arnold might have been in his cradle then, might he? It's happy. He, of course, as always with Bax, he's inclined to take something that's happy and suddenly show you a dark side of it. But that's part of his genius, the fact that his moods he's able to achieve with the same material.
And another curiosity, Bax obviously again insisted the Third Symphony is pure music. He wanted it to be taken seriously as a symphony for you to appreciate the structure. But there's that quotation from Nietzsche, which he did scratch out before publication, but it was still there, wasn't it?
Yes.
My wisdom became pregnant on lonely mountains, upon barren stones she brought forth her young.
Yes. Yes, I'm a simple chap, and I don't think that I understand particularly that quotation, although I've read my Nietzsche like a good boy. But what I am always concerned to do, I'm a conductor, at least that's what I'm trying, and I really do feel that my business is musical voicing. So I don't care if he puts a quotation on every page. What he's going to get out of me is quavers. Do you know, if I may put it that way?
Well, and something which is a challenge for you is that first movement, because here we have something which comes more frequently in the later symphonies, but we have a huge structure, somewhere around 20 minutes, which seems to contain its own slow movement.
Yes, actually there's some objection to that slow movement, isn't there? I've got an idea about this, and that is that a great deal of Bax's slow movements go very well when played quicker. He himself, incidentally, played his own music quicker than he seemed to demand. I mean, if he says moderato, although I'm in trouble with the word moderato with him, because I cannot find at the beginning of the Sixth Symphony a pulse which could be described as quick. If you do it with a quick pulse, it throws away the grinding discords in the wind and so on. But I don't find that the weakness, I know Lewis does draw attention to this, that lots of people have found the middle of the first movement of the third something that they can't quite take because of its length.
Is it just the difficulty of balancing that immense first movement against the rest of the symphony, which is obviously a particular challenge for you?
Yes. Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think, you see, it is such a unified symphony, isn't it? The rising note phrase on the bassoon at the beginning, the second subject which has repeated notes, the wonderful start of the slow part with a tune which John McCabe has drawn attention to, it's almost as good as fanned, starts with repeated notes. When we come back to the first material, now on the strings, not on the bassoon and wind, the development is truncated. Well, you see, he has stated his moods quite clearly. What a good composer to truncate the recapitulation and not to spread it out. So I have no trouble at all with the big slow part of that movement. It's once again his command of contrast, because the last part of the first movement, which is downright coda, is the first material straight over again. The second movement starts with a repeated note tune. The third movement starts with repeated notes but with a rising phrase lower down in the strings. The Epilogue has a rising phrase on harp and lower strings, and some nice repeated notes in the first melodic material. The end of the symphony plays the first rising note tune beautifully on the brass, but in a new harmonic guise, as I've said before, showing that he's gone through some experience. Now, I find that a unified symphony, and I find that the slow middle of the first movement, since it is made of a shape of material he's already said, this is my symphony, this is the stuff I'm going to make my symphony of, that's fine by me. I tend to start the big slow tune, I think, a little bit faster nowadays than I used.
Let's linger with the Epilogue just for a few seconds, because
yes, that's all right.
Well, we have here one of these Bax combined scherzo and finale, last movements with the Epilogue attached, and it's the Epilogue that bewitches here in so many ways. And it's only just the last 7 minutes or so, but it's a new sound world here.
Oh yes, and a simple one. As I say, it's much more simple in layout. Just the ostinato, and the tunes played over the ostinato. But how he registers those themes and the bareness with which he orchestrates it is really quite extraordinary. And the way that he produces those extraordinary chords playing the first material of the whole symphony, rising and falling, the three notes rising and falling again, on muted brass and divisi cellos and so on, low down, which is a sort of darkness invading his lovely Epilogue, but nevertheless he gets back after those utterances on muted brass and cellos, he gets back again to what I can only call the beautiful part of that Epilogue. It's as if that beauty has overcome the darkness in the symphony. Incidentally, this is the only thing, in fact, that I can find to disagree with the great Barbarolli's recording, because I do find that this is a mood quite unlike anything else in music, the Bax Epilogue of the Third Symphony. Barbarolli's performance is so beautiful. It starts to push one towards purely personal and human beauty. But I think in that Epilogue he started to realise some sort of very natural and visionary beauty, which he eventually realises right up at the end of the Sixth Symphony.
Well, this Epilogue, it's not just the conclusion to the third, it's the conclusion to the first three symphonies, really.
Yeah, I still believe that, yes.
Then we have the fourth, 1930.
Yeah.
It's a contented symphony, an effusive, ebullient symphony compared to the ones which came before.
Yeah.
Is it Bax's C Symphony?
Well, a lot has been made of the what is it, flood tide, isn't it, of the opening. I suppose in a way it is. The middle movement, incidentally, does have a considerable seriousness at its heart. But once again, that's because Bax understood contrast. But the outer movements are rumbustious and happy. Incidentally, he still, even though this is a happy and not demanding symphony, nevertheless, he still uses his approach to metamorphosing themes and ideas. For instance, the fanfare in the first movement, da 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 da, you find comes back in the last movement as da 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 da. That's perfectly conscious. That's good composition, I think. But it's not a symphony, with the exception of the middle of the second movement. It's not a symphony that poses many problems.
It does have a striking opening, though, doesn't it? You've got the six horns and the organ again, almost straight away, almost sort of summoning up the depths.
Yes, and you were talking about influences. I put it in a programme a long time ago, besides Stravinsky, because I said, the number of things that were said about Bax's luscious meanderings. If you wanted to see perhaps the influence of Stravinsky, just look at the number of accents in the first 3 pages of Bax 4. Everything is thundered out in accents.
And then there's how do you describe this? There's a sort of dreamy calm of the slow movement. I know people make a lot of the seascapes, partly because of where Bax chose to work and his preferred holiday places on the Irish coast, and then up in Inverness, looking out towards the Orkneys.
That's right.
And obviously loving the cliffs and the sea and the Atlantic. But do we get anything from comparing this to Debussy's La Mer?
Well, I don't think so, because, well, once again, for me, the procedure is so much different. I mean, he loved La Mer. There's no doubt about that. So do I. In actual fact, I'm sometimes allowed to conduct it. I've always said, of course, that you've only got to give me any foreign composer. Then, because of the way I've been pigeonholed as a conductor, I can make it sound like Vaughan Williams in 3 bars. But I think that, no, I don't think it's... I think they all had their approach to sea music, which was their own. I mean, Rimsky-Korsakov has sea music. Debussy has sea music. Vaughan Williams certainly does, and Bax does. I think they all do it in different ways. I think that you can always find in Bax little derivations which are, to me, unimportant. They just mean that it was the music in the air at the time, which will point you towards Debussy, because I think he admired Debussy very, very much. But of course he didn't all. You don't find a lot of Debussy in the symphonies. It's just that when he wants to use that sort of impressionism, he does. It's there for the using, and he does.
I'm curious about a remark attributed to Delius at around this time, who Bax obviously knew well and admired. Delius criticised Bax for not being more concentrated. His form is too loose.
Yes, that's right. Bax should concentrate. His forms are loose. Yeah, that's wonderful, because, of course, in the general critical acceptance of these composers, Delius would be held to be even more formless than poor old Bax. But, of course, Delius's procedure in making a work formal, and I believe that Delius is very strong formally, because nobody does it quite like him, is dependent very much on phrase length and the holding of a mood by definite appropriation of phrase lengths in his tunes. I think Sea Drift is a fine example of it. The violin concerto is practically built on phrase length relationships. But Bax's wasn't. Bax developed. He doesn't develop in the 19th century European way. He develops more in the Sibelian way, that is to say, by the metamorphosing of themes. But of course even that doesn't stem entirely from Sibelius, because there's plenty of that in Liszt, and Bax knew his Liszt. So he was undoubtedly influenced. We were talking about influences earlier. He was undoubtedly influenced by Debussy and loved him. Also he was influenced by Liszt. Also he loved the Russian composers and was influenced by Glazunov. They're all influenced by everybody. I think that sometimes we search for derivations unnecessarily.
Well, there's the Fourth Symphony, the Fourth Bax Symphony. It sort of stands on its own as a pivotal point in the cycle of 7. The Fifth Symphony followed pretty well hot on the heels of number 4, 1931 to 32, and this was a time in which Bax was one of the big names in British music. He was being championed by Sir Henry Wood at the Proms. He was working with Adrian Bolt, being broadcast. The Second and Third Symphonies were very well received. Bax's Fifth begins with a slow introduction that, well, Todd, it does remind you so much of Sibelius. This one. It's almost explicit, isn't it?
Well, it's supposed to be. We know that he admired and loved Sibelius music, and yes, certainly the opening figure, on the low clarinets and so on, is certainly something out of Sibelius' Fourth Symphony. I'm sure quite conscious, but why not? Why shouldn't one composer pay tribute to another? But then the working out of the allegro immediately after it is pure Bax, and not Sibelius. Of course, throughout that symphony there are moods which are like Sibelius. Bax was a tremendous composer for capturing moods. He knew how to do it, and not only in thematic and harmonic sense, but also in his choice of orchestration, which is quite remarkable. I mean, we look upon Holst as being our great orchestrator, and quite right he is. And Walton is a great orchestrator, and Britten is a great orchestrator. Bax is as resourceful as any of them. You find extraordinary effects all over Bax, and he colours that symphony with Sibelian sounds, done absolutely consciously, perfectly open. Well, don't you think so? I'm reminded of Sibelius constantly in that piece, not in the striking allegro in the first movement, but in the working out of his second subject, in the whole of the second movement, which incidentally is a rather short, slow movement for Bax, and of course in the huge chorales of the epilogue in the last movement. But then there's very little, if anything, of Sibelius in the furious allegro of the last movement.
Well, the character really of the fifth changes completely in the finale, doesn't it? It could almost be Shostakovich for the first minute of it.
Yes, it could, although I think Bax does it rather better. But perhaps I shouldn't say that, since Shostakovich is recognised and Bax is not. But it's fleet. I think that's the only word for it. The moment you get into the allegro, well, you start off, don't you, with a statement of the thing that's going to come back as a chorale in the epilogue. And then straight away, I mean, it's a terse, short statement, not meandering and vague at all, but very, very direct and forceful. And then straight away you're smashed into that fleet, fast allegro. Yes, Shostakovich would be remembered or projected there. But then, of course, he admired his Russian composers.
And there's that finale plus epilogue again. He's found a formula, hasn't
he? Oh,
yes,
absolutely. I think it's wonderful because the epilogues definitely do sum up the experience of the symphony.
2 years later, 1934, Bax now in his early 50s, and he's sort of settled into some kind of routine as a composer. The time in Ireland, sketching in London, writing and orchestrating on the west coast of Scotland, gazing over the sea. And that's where the Sixth Symphony was largely written. Is it his finest, Todd?
Oh, to me, incontestably, the greatest symphony that he wrote. An astonishing symphony. I mean, I place it beside, quite honestly, and I'm willing to take people on in correspondence if they so choose, I stand it beside the finest symphonies of the 20th century. And if the finest symphonies of the 20th century, it certainly ought to contend with some of the 19th or the 18th, because it is a tremendously developed piece of music. I mean, one feels that one ought to hop over the first two movements, wonderful though they are, because of the extraordinary achievement of the last. But a short first movement.
But there's a new sound here, isn't there? There's a bleakness and a wildness about it, which right from the start, in fact. And I was wondering how different this looks to you as a conductor, even on paper.
Yes, it starts off with those grinding wind chords and the terrific ostinato. And look how it's scored, ostinato on a bass trombone, going on, poor man. And then an ostinato in diminution, made out of that first ostinato, and then the musical material, the themes, stated and developed in a first movement, which is absolutely straightforward and short. What one does get with this symphony is a feeling of his now never being expansive. He's never expansive. He's cut everything down to the bone. And it doesn't strike me as being a symphony that one can call readily a romantic one if we think of 19th and early 20th century romanticism. This is a wild, frightening symphony. It is a pagan symphony, and it is a spiritual one. It doesn't have many nicely dressed people about on the landscape.
And the second movement, it's such a haunting, almost wistful slow movement at times. It feels like an older man.
I think, well, yes, it's very simple, of course. It's a very simple second movement, isn't it, with its Scotch snap and so on. I suppose somebody will say with that trumpet tune, trumpet tune, Sibelius. But it's not a Sibelian tune at all. Yeah, tranquil in a way, beautiful in a way, compared to the storm of the first movement, and so therefore Bax at work again with his contrasts, a good dramatic contrast between the two movements. But also, philosophically, this is an important movement because it sets up the last. The last movement has got to provide a different mood still from those first two. And how he does it, and he does it as if he was shaking his fist and being mischievous at the same time to all those people who said he doesn't write formally, because this is a straightforward form, isn't it? It's an introduction, a scherzo, and an epilogue. How marvellous to say, here you are, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to write out what the form is. And of course the form is that he gives you the wonderful clarinet tune all by itself. Oh, this can't be Bax, surely we must have some luscious chords and overscoring about. But there isn't. It's just one clarinet. That tune is taken up. The woodwind give what is a most important thing in the movement. That's to say, a little few bar, just a few bars phrase, which is different music from the clarinet tune. Then he turns the clarinet tune by an accelerando into the fast bassoon tune. It's the same notes of the scherzo. The scherzo's headlong. What is going to happen with this extraordinarily straightforward and open and simple form? He now, what is it Perry said? He gets you into a climax where the earth is torn up by its roots. I think that's the phrase. I'm not quite sure. It is, to me, one of the biggest and most searing climaxes in all music. Funnily enough, right at the peak of it, that little wind phrase that came after the clarinet tune is stated full force on the orchestra. Then it subsides, and we have the epilogue, in which exactly the same material is used. And the work ends with that little phrase, now on the horns and so on. It's a tour de force. Practically no two bars are not related in that last movement. Of course, a lot is made of the outright quote from Tapiola, which he puts in the middle. He just smashes it out on the strings. But after all, the opening tune of the whole symphony does have a shape rather like that phrase. People don't spot that. They don't notice that.
But everybody hears Tapiola, so they think Sibelius again. And yet this was dedicated originally to Szymanowski, and then that was erased, and Sir Adrian Bolt's name was put on it. What do you read into that?
Well, as you know, I'm a Bolt pupil, a great admirer of Sir Adrian, especially as a conductor. And I can't help thinking perhaps that Bax was being a little bit mischievous, since Bolt was one of the people who found him not very strong on form, you know. And Bax knew that he had written a formal masterpiece. That is to say, he was guided by the exigencies of form in that symphony. So what better thing to do than to dedicate it to the man who might not have thought he was rather formal. I remember Sir Adrian saying to me once, the symphonies came too quick, not enough thought. Now what I find in the symphonies of Bax, which makes me so devoted to them, is the power of thought. So Sir Adrian and I had one or two pretty good fights on that. I never forget him saying, actually, we were talking about a formal thing. I hope you don't mind this digression. He came to hear me do Brahms' second symphony, and he said, what do you do in the little bit, which is what he called the third movement? That pause with the oboe. So I said, yes, Sir Adrian. And he said, why do you make that ghastly rallentando before it? And I said, well, you can't walk into that pause like a brick wall, can you? He said, why not? It's a surprise then. Oh, Todd, it sounded so continental. But then, of course, you're Celtic, aren't you? And I think he had a bit of that view of Bax. I remember hearing him rehearse one of the Bax works, I forget which it was, and there was a question as to whether there were triplets or measured or tremolo. And Sir Adrian said, oh, it's all tremolo. I don't know why he puts it that way. It's something to do with being Irish. And of course, Bax, as you know, wasn't Irish.
Well, for Sir Adrian Bolt, the symphonies came too quickly after one another. But then we get to the seventh, the last one. Now, here there was a gap. This was 1938-39, and we find Bax saying that for several years now, I've had no joy in my work. And he turned down a BBC commission earlier than that in 1936, saying he was rather tired.
That's right.
Musically. Is it just a question of him feeling his age? Because it doesn't feel as though the fires are burning quite as brightly.
Well, I think that's true. But I find them... Well, also he said somewhere, and I've written a tremendous amount of music in my time, and he had. And I think that we forget that there is a great area of his music, as with Tchaikovsky, for instance, that we don't know, we've never heard. I mean, think of a thing like Spring Fire, written in 1913 and a work of tremendous passion and power. Must have cost him tremendous labour to get it down in full score, and he never heard it. It's never played. So all that tremendous work was done. There's a great corpus of work there, which must have tired him out artistically. And one knows that feeling as a performer, that if you do 16 concerts in 3 weeks, you wonder if you're ever going to do a concert again. Of course, it does come back, and with him, because of his age, it didn't come back. But the seventh is a much simpler symphony, and to me represents a straightforward goodbye. He still had things to say, but they do not have the complication or the aspiration of the earlier symphonies.
He's more relaxed here, isn't he, somehow?
Yes.
It is. There's a feeling of resignation. You can't escape it.
There is. That the first movement is still a man showing that he can jolly well grip sonata form and get on with it. The second movement is very beautiful, very, very idyllic. And the third movement, with its, once again, formal acceptation of a theme and variations, shall I do? I'm not allowed to do this sort of thing. So he does it. Not doing much of a change in the variations, just in different guises. It's more like a Passacagli, isn't it? But then a quite ineffable beauty in the epilogue, which is clearly to me is a man saying goodbye. I can't do any more.
I wanted to ask you about the second movement because, I wondered how tough it is to conduct, because it's in that three-part shape again, isn't it?
That's right,
The sort of symphony within a movement.
Yeah.
And Bax doesn't seem to have felt that Sir Adrian Boult got it quite right. And when he heard the recordings of the premiere in New York, felt it was too quick, I think, didn't he? And he wrote later that he intended to convey a sort of heavy summer languor. But is it a hard movement to bring off? Yes.
I don't know whether it's heavy. A summer languor, definitely. It isn't heavy. I mean, it's lightly scored in some ways. Incidentally, that first performance, Sir Adrian's tempo of the first movement is furious. Sounds as if he really wanted to get through it, or perhaps he was trying to prove something to the New York Orchestra. But it's very interesting that Bax puts a metronome. This is the only symphony in which he put metronome marks, and he puts a metronome in the second movement, which is in the 70s. So that's quite clearly not a slow and languorous thing, and there's rubato within that movement, which takes it on even faster. But I think the point is that it's composed of the most wonderfully joined phrases, and if you do the joins in Bax rather than show them, which is what we all ought to do with all music, make the join rather than show it. I mean, he himself said, don't treat me as a vertical composer, I'm a contrapuntal composer. And that's perfectly true. And many conductors have erred in finding these beautiful chords in Bax and dwelling on them. That's one thing you must never do. They're there, but they are part of a procedure. They're part of line. They're part of a mood. They're not to be settled on, a pause over every suspension, a pause over every lovely new harmony. And he does give you there in that second movement a chance to continue that line right the way through the movement. I think if you want to establish languor, and I can see exactly what he meant, it's already there in the Cor Anglais tune that starts the movement. Thereafter, everything that happens is happening in that atmosphere of languor.
Now the epilogue, Todd, it's uncommonly short for Bax. Does it work not just as the conclusion of the Seventh Symphony, but as the conclusion for the cycle?
I think it's the conclusion of the cycle, yes. I think this is the point that Sir Adrian, it's one of the points that I really quarrelled with Sir Adrian about, and that was that the fifth coming close to the fourth, and the fourth not really far from the third, it's not a lack of thought. Rather, it is that he is using the same ideas of thought as he proceeds and improves them. And so therefore he doesn't have to think of new things. Somebody once said composing is almost too easy for Bax, because he had this phenomenal musical technique. So he could think in musical terms without having to think, shall I do something different? You can always tell a Bax score for certain thumbprints, as you can with any major composer. But nevertheless, all the moods of those symphonies are different. He never repeats himself in mood at all. And of course there are some subtle moods. I mean, what on earth is happening at the climax of the sixth. I'm still frightened of it.
It's almost 20 years from the first to the last symphony. What do you think Bax achieved in his own musical language over that distance, over that period of time?
Certainly a clear understanding that if there had been any criticism, as was often made early on, about his proliferation of ideas and colours and orchestration and harmony, that he'd been able to clarify that and get down to the bones of music, the skeletons, as it were, in the symphonies, which is what really most symphonic journeys for composers do have an element of that. I mean, in Sibelius, it comes out to a single movement symphony. That's a clear course, though you can see in the fourth Sibelius how it's going to happen. In Honegger, it's very clear. If you see Honegger 5, Honegger 5th Symphony, I would put beside Vaughan Williams 4th and 6th and Bax 6th. We never hear that. We never hear that symphony. Who else cleans up his act, as we might call it? Well, Nielsen. Although I did have a row with dear Bob Simpson. As you know, I've recorded practically all his symphonies. And I said, you know, there's something wrong, Bob. Your symphonies are getting more and more complicated and longer and longer. It's perfectly possible for it to happen that way round, I suppose. But I think Bax is clarity, leaning through to simple forms like that introduction, scherzo, and epilogue of the sixth. Scherzo and trio, I should say, shouldn't I? There, scherzo and trio, it's right out of the 18th century. Simple forms, all my forms are simple.
In terms of the symphonic music of the 1920s and 30s, though, Todd, looking back now from this distance, do we get a clearer sense of Bax's place among his peers?
No, I think because he never had, well, we don't know how many sympathetic performances he had, because we know that he didn't get many performances. Even at his greatest time, he wasn't getting the kind of performances that Elgar and Vaughan Williams got, or that Benjamin Britten got. I doubt very much if any of those Bax symphonies in his lifetime was played as much as perhaps Walton's second in his. So it's something we talked about at the beginning, this strange lack of ability that we seem to have in assessing our own nation's music. John McCabe put his finger on this some time ago when he said to me that one of the things that's remarkable about British music is its colossal variety in the 20th century. And Bax's music then was not appreciated because that's in his lifetime. He had a little vogue, as we know, but it disappeared pretty quickly because he didn't get many performances. He didn't get idiomatic performances. Something I've always drawn attention to when talking to players about it is that when an orchestra sees Bax for the first time, it doesn't know the language. Now, all orchestral players are wonderful in trying to give you an authentic view of the composer. Even if they say at break time, oh, this is rubbish, isn't it? Nevertheless, they do their darndest when they're playing to give you something honest. And so what happens with a complicated harmonic language of Bax, like Bax's, is that they give you something like Rachmaninoff or Richard Strauss, which projects Bax's romantic moods like Rachmaninoff's and Richard Strauss's. And they're not. They are totally different. So in his own time, those things couldn't have been appreciated. It's only now, and it has been, after all, it has occurred to a number of people down the years that we really ought to know more of this chap's music. So it's only now being appreciated. Have there been three series of the symphonies? There's the Loretta one, there's Dear Jack Thompson's one, there's the Naxos one, and now there's going to be Old Handley's. This, to me, means that enough people have thought, well, you know, we really ought to know this stuff, to have given enough power to getting these things done. I think we're getting near it. I mean, I thought that Jack Thompson's Fifth was absolutely marvellous, wonderful recording, wonderful playing, of course. And I've listened to some of the Naxos series and have learned so much, because, of course, the conductor there, David Lloyd Jones, knows his Russian music. And Bax was undoubtedly influenced by Russian music. And so I've discovered a lot there. But I think that I've possibly got something to say myself, because I'm 100% Celt, as Sir Adrian pointed out in my Brahms little movement. And there was a lot about Bax that was Celtic, even if it was assumed. Sometimes when we come across something that enslaves us, it makes us more like it than we were before. And a man who can teach himself Erse when he's grown up and write poetry and plays and short stories in it, this is no mean intellect, nor is it an undevoted man to the inspirations he's found in Celtic life. I myself can't get enough of Ireland. Mine is a slightly different view from his. I just like the jokes.